Because notice what she's doing. She's weeping and washing his feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Now Jesus understood what was happening. The Pharisee said, he must not understand, or he wouldn't let this happen. Jesus knew exactly what was happening. And then he told a little story to explain what was happening. And here's what he says, verse 40. Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say to thee. And he said, Master, say on. Now here's a little story. Now, by the way, before I read this, when Jesus gives parables, when he makes up little stories like this, these are made-up stories. These are not real events. These are made-up stories, but they are made up to make a moral point. The parables are invented stories which are invented to make a moral point. And so this is a story to make a point. Let's see if we get the story here. There was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one owed him 500 pence, the other 50. Now, we don't need to worry about what a pence is. We can just say one owed him 500 and one 50. In other words, one is a whole lot and one's not very much. So this man is a creditor and he's got 2 debtors. One doesn't owe very much. One owes a lot. Now, do we understand what the symbolism of this story is? The creditor is like God, and the ones who owe him are like the sinners. And he says that the Pharisee, in this story, Pharisee's like the one who doesn't owe very much because he thinks he's really holy. So he didn't think his debt to God is very great. He thinks he's pretty much got it made. There might be, like people say sometimes, I may not be perfect, but at least I'm not as bad as that person over there. He's like that. He's saying, well, I may not be perfect, but I do this and this and this. He could probably tell you all the different things he did and how holy he was. So he's like the one who doesn't know very much. And the woman in this story is like the one who owes 500. She has a huge debt. She's in the eyes of, at least in the Pharisee, a lot worse off. But notice what it says, verse 42. When they, meaning both of them, had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Now it says they, meaning both of them, could not pay. Even though Simon, or even though the Pharisee, or that was his name here, even though the Pharisee didn't think he owed very much, he still couldn't pay. He couldn't pay the debt. That's what Jesus said. And she, though she owed a lot, she can't pay. Neither one can pay. Neither one can atone for their sin. Neither one can make the payment. So it says he, the creditor, God, in other words, when neither one could pay, he frankly forgave them both. Frankly means openly or freely. To frankly do something means to openly do it. When we say to somebody, when we're bluntly honest with them, we say, I'm just being frank with you. You ever heard that before? That means openly and freely. I'm freely and openly telling you. So it says here, because they could not pay, he freely and openly forgave them both. He freely forgave them both. Did you get that? He freely forgave them both. That's God's attitude. See, Jesus is making this moral point that here's God's attitude about this situation. He's looking down at humanity, and there's some that are better than others in a relative sense. Maybe the Pharisee's a little more holy than the woman of the town who's a sinner. But from God's point of view, you all owe a debt you can't pay. So here's what I'm going to do. Instead of saying, you rascals, you sinners, you all owe me a debt that you can't pay. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to throw you all into hell. Yeah, I'll show you. No, he said he freely forgave them both. Just the opposite of what most people think. Now, if that's God's attitude, think people ought to know that? Think that's something people should know? Think we should know it as Christians? Yes, I think we should. Notice then, that's pretty good. I could just say the end and stop right there and we could say, wow, that was good. But listen, this is where it gets really interesting, the next part. He frankly forgave them both. Now listen to what Jesus said. He asked then a question. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him the most? That's the question. Which one of them loves him the most? The one who, and by the way, you could say from one point of view, they're equal because they both owe a debt they can't pay. But one of them doesn't think his debt's very bad. He doesn't think he needs the forgiveness as much as the other. And the other one sees that their debt is really bad, and to forgive this big debt, it produces a greater sense of gratitude, is what Jesus is saying. He said, tell me which will love him the most. Verse 43 said, Simon answered and said, I suppose it is he to whom he forgave the most. That's good logic, isn't it? And that's right. And Jesus said, you have rightly judged. And then to make the point, he turned to the woman and he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet. But she has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. He says, I came into your house and you didn't give me any water for my feet. You didn't love me very much. That's what he's saying. You didn't have much love for me, much gratitude. He says, this woman has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. He says, you gave me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. You didn't give me a kiss. You don't love me very much. She has not ceased to kiss my feet. Verse 40 says, my head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. What he's saying is, by contrast, you don't love me as much as she does. Now, in the context of the story, when he said, which one will love him the most? He said, one didn't owe very much and one owed a lot. He freely forgave them both. Which loves him the most? He said, it's the one who is forgiven the most. So what he's saying is, the woman is acting the way she is, showing this extraordinary love to Jesus because she believes she's forgiven. She's showing this kind of love because she is expressing her gratitude for the fact that she believes she's forgiven. Now, here's my question before we go on reading. How did she get the idea that she was forgiven? Where did she get that idea? You know what? It doesn't tell us here where she got the idea. Here's what I think. This is only 2 chapters after what we just read. I think she was back there in chapter 5 amongst those Pharisees who were all ganged around the house. I think she was there and saw that man come through the roof. And I think she saw Jesus look up at him with the man displaying not asking for it, not saying, I'll try to reform myself, I'll try to do better, Jesus, I'm going to turn over a new leaf. The guy didn't say anything. And Jesus just said to him, I want to tell you something, your sins are forgiven. I think when she heard that, she thought to herself, this man's giving forgiveness of sin in the name of God. And if that man's sins are forgiven, then my sins can be forgiven. And I think she thought about that for a couple of chapters here and came to believe that Jesus is offering free forgiveness of sins. And so she came to this man who gives away forgiveness of sins, the avenue of forgiveness, and she's filled with gratitude and love for him. And she comes into the house just overwhelmed with her love for Jesus, and she begins to cry and weep and wash his feet with her hair and all of the things we read here, because she believes she's forgiven. And this was her response. So, look at what he says in verse 47. Wherefore I say to thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. In other words, she demonstrates that her sins, that she knew her sins are many, but they're forgiven, and she's demonstrated it by her love. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And then he turned to her and said, thy sins are forgiven. Just to make sure she got the point, he said to her the same thing he said to that man, didn't he? He didn't say, because you cried, your sins are forgiven. Because you washed my feet, your sins are forgiven. In fact, he makes it plain here, the reason she washed his feet and cried was because she already believed she was forgiven. And so he just makes sure that she's got the message, and he says to her, your sins are forgiven. Again, he doesn't say because, he just says they are. He gave it away freely and frankly, just like the man in the story. Verse 49. And when they sat at meat with him, began to say within themselves, who is this that forgives sins also? They're upset here too. Verse 50. And he said to the woman, he just ignored all the critics, and he's just directing his attention to this woman. He says, thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. What kind of faith? She believed. What did she believe? She believed her sins were forgiven. And you know what? When she believed her sins were forgiven, it produced in her a gratitude and a love for the one who was the avenue of that forgiveness. Now, if you think I'm putting a wrong spin on it, let me just conclude by turn to John's, not his gospel, but his epistle, 1 John, chapter 4. I want to show you something. In the light of everything we've just read, let me just show you a little verse here. Chapter 4, verse 19. 1 John chapter 4, verse 19. Please notice this wording in the light of what we just read. Look at what it says. We love him. Why do we love him? Because. Because is a word that tells us why. We love him because he first loved us. Now it doesn't say he loves us because we loved him. It says we love him because he first loved us. You see what it's emphasizing here? What he's saying is what I've been emphasizing all morning. He moved first. He loved first. He forgave first. He forgave us before we ever said anything, before we were ever conscious of having sinned, before we were ever born, as a matter of fact, before we'd ever committed any sins. He knew ahead of time what we'd do and forgave us ahead of time. What's missing in the puzzle is we need to find out about it and see what Jesus said is if